that vary because they illustrate something else. There's a woman whose husband was very anti-Semitic, and in Poland, but she had a Jewish friend, and the husband worked on the railroad, and he was often away from this local railroad station, was often traveling, I guess part of his job, obviously. And what has transpired was that this woman, this wife of this anti-Semitic Polish person, took this woman in and she hid her in the attic of the railroad station where her husband worked. And she survived the war, almost 18 months there. The husband did not know. He kept making anti-Semitic remarks and statements, but the woman survived that way. We did not interview the rescue, but we interviewed the survivor. So sometimes we didn't match all of them up, obviously. One of the stories that I might relate to you is, and you may have heard me relate this before, so forgive me if you have. Perhaps this will be the last one because I want to move on to some of the findings and some of the illustrate some of the findings at them. This is a story that has taken place. Obviously, we've interviewed both the rescued and the rescuers, and this is the Oscar Olener story, and that is a cousin of mine, same spelling as my own. They were in a ghetto. Oscar Olener and Hannah Olener were in a ghetto. Their ghetto, just like mine, was donated some Friday, one fine day, 1942. And interesting how people behave under stress. The Oleners had a small child. May have been, again, 7, 8 months old boy. And in this terrible trance and terrifying moment of fear, people were scurrying and hiding. Jews were hiding in basements. Well, the Oleners took their little baby and were hiding in the same basement, but the baby cried. And so those people, talking about non-altruism, they told them to leave. They screamed at them, "Get out of here. They're going to find us. The noise will lead the Nazis here," because the Nazis were searching house to house, street by street. So indeed, they had to leave. They had no choice. They went back to their apartment, which was adjacent upstairs. And Hannah Olener she rocked the child to sleep and left it there. Anyways, thinking that maybe the child would fall asleep. And the child did fall asleep, but as soon as they went down to hide again, came and murdered the child. Just threw it out. The Oleners then escaped, barefooted in a state of horrendous, they were just like animals. They didn't know if they were alive or dead. And they ran to a nearby village, barefooted. They came to a house of a railroad conductor and his wife, and simple, uneducated people. And he knew them from before the war. They knocked at the door, and the people saw them in the state that they looked in, and they let them in immediately. But they had nowhere to hide them, and they had nowhere to hide them. Well, I won't do the drawing because I'm probably not very good at drawing anyway. So they decided to, it was at a tiny little house of talking about if the heart is in the right place, you can find a way. The heart was apparently in the right place. They had a barn outside, about, I don't know, say 50 yards away, and from the house, that is. And they also had a big I guess, a stack. They stacked up lots of bricks that they bought before the war. A stack of bricks, I guess is the word I was looking for, that they purchased before the war. And stacked them up just in the field right next, not too far from the barn. Anyway, they hit upon an idea. Since the war broke out, they didn't have enough money to build a house. The intention was to build a house ultimately out of the bricks. And they took these bricks, brick by brick, and they carried them and laid them, piled them up neatly right against the side of the barn. Inside, from inside the barn, they cut out a small hole on the bottom, on the floor, a crawl space. So from the, in other words, it looked like a bunch of bricks, sort of piled up, thousands of bricks. Inside those bricks, there was a bunker, really. They had some 2x4s and 4x4s and straw and some quilts and so forth. And these people lived like this for two years. Oscar and Hannah Olener, who just lost their child, feeling guilty. This woman would love these women, woman and men. Let's give them a name because I think they'd be known. Yamrov, the pronunciation is Yamrov. This Mr. and Mrs. Yamrov loved them, cared for them. They took them in during the night when it was safe. They took them into the house. During the day, what they did is they fed them. They made out a kind of a bucket, a wooden bucket, I guess, a box, which looked to the nearby nosy neighbors that it was feed for the pigs, but inside were plates of food. And as she was walking from the house to the barn, she would sing a song, not just a song of joy, but also a signal that she was bringing them food. And as I said, during the day, they would be there. During the night, they would sometimes come out and get some tender loving care and encouragement and some news and hope, and because, you know, you can go mad staying in a dark bunker. Anyway, to speed this up, one fine day, the neighbor's daughter, the Yamrovs had a son and a daughter. The son is in the States now. The daughter had a friend, a little girl, the same age, about 12 years of age or so, who came to play with her. It was before Christmas. That very moment, on that very occasion, Mrs. Yamrov asked Mrs. Olener to stay and help her sew a dress for Christmas as a present, because Mrs. Olener could sew. So she did, and she stayed in one of the two rooms that they had. The little girl saw, the door was ajar to the second bedroom, or second room, I should say. It wasn't really a bedroom. She saw this brunette-looking woman, this Jewish-looking woman, or brunette-looking, non-Slavic-looking woman. She went home, and she told Mommy that she thinks that the Yamrov are hiding Jews. This lady, a Jewess. Again, to speed this up, the Mrs. Yamrov, and they realized that there may be danger, so she went back to the bunker, sneaked back into the bunker. 9 hours later, the police have arrived. Only this time, the Granatove, the blue policeman, as well as the Gestapo, local Gestapo. And they came in, they surrounded the place, and they say, they come into the house and they say to Mr. and Mrs. Yamrov and the kids and so forth, "You are hiding Jews, where are they?" And Mrs. Yamrov is a very tense lady, and she's shaking. The captain, or rather the lieutenant, Gestapo, notices that. So he puts the pressure on her. But she somehow withstands this enormous tension. They look in the house, they find nothing, then they move to the barn. Right in the barn. This is a true story. You couldn't make up a story like this, because we've interviewed both of them. But it's unbelievable. Each of the stories is unbelievable as it is. They come to the barn, and they surround this this barn, and they start looking. Both Mr. Yamrov and Mrs. Yamrov are in the barn. Again, this officer notices how tense Mrs. Yamrov is. She's making the sign of the cross, and she is ready to fall apart. So they start looking, and Mr. Yamrov says, "Gentlemen, There's no Jews here. If there are any Jews, I have no idea. I don't know what you... Somebody must have been misinforming you. And as he's doing that, he's covering up that hole more and more, piling up higher, covering up with bundles of straw and hay and other implements. Well, this time the officer takes the pistol out of his holster and puts it against the temple of Mrs. English, and he says to her, "Okay, now, will you tell me where you're hiding the Jews?" And it looked to Mr. Yamarov that she was going to tell, because she was opening up her mouth to say something. Perhaps, I doubt that, but it sounded like, it looked like. He sort of jumped towards her. Mr. Yamarov grabbed her by the hand or the arm and shook her a little bit. He says, "Sweetheart, sweetheart, what are you afraid of? We have nothing to hide. These gentlemen are not going to find anything. Pull yourself together. There's nothing to be afraid of." And then he says this, makes this Polish statement, which is not translatable into English other than to say that if one does not carry butter on one's head, one is not afraid of it melting. In other words, gentlemen, if one has nothing to hide, why should we be afraid of? He defined reality for her and for him, and he just was determined that nothing is going to happen. Well, that is not the end of it yet, because one of the, I remember telling this story here once, this very same, as I remember, it was a different stage here. One of the policemen got an itch on his back here, on the spine, right over here. So he went to the edge of the bricks, and he started going like this, and scratching himself. Well, the bricks were shaking. They're not cemented together. They were just a pile of bricks. You have to be careful, but there are tons of them, many of them. Well, Mrs. Oliner is gasping, frightened. She's shaking. Mr. Oliner, Oscar Oliner, takes a pillow and puts it in her face to keep her from breathing heavily. And so, again, to summarize this, nothing happened. The Oliners are still alive. They have another son. The Yamarovs, children are alive. Mr. and Mrs. Yamarov died recently, but we interviewed both of them. These are the kinds of stories that permeate in our files. We have these hundreds of stories like that, many, many more. And the question keeps constantly coming, why did they do it and others didn't? For instance, I'll give you one quick example of someone who didn't. A victim, a Jew, ran away from an execution squad and runs to someone in the fields in a village, and the man is a brick maker. In other words, there are cottage industries called brick making industries. You make your own bricks and you sell to a neighbor to build his house, his or her house. So he came over to this brick maker, this little small cottage industry factory, and he says to him, he pleads with him. He says, "Please, sir, the Nazis are after me. I'm Jewish. Could you hide me for a day or so? I'll repay you. I'll be very grateful to you." He virtually goes down on his knees. The guy looks at him and he says, "Sorry, I can't do it. My wife and children would be in danger. I'm afraid. I can't do it. Go across the hills in that other village. Somebody's going to help you there." See the point? That some people didn't. Some people didn't. And we have about 140 stories of those who did not rescue. And so this is what the study is about. Namely, looking at rescuers, looking at bystanders, a control group, and looking at rescued, who are telling us why they did it. Now, as to the findings based upon this sample, some of the findings have been reported in a local newspaper, partly accurately, partly a little bit exaggerated because it was a telephone interview and so forth. But before I address the findings themselves, I know that Professor Steiner told me that I have an hour and a half, so I'm watching this pretty carefully. Before we talk about the findings, let me first tell you what rescuers had to go through. It was a difficult job to be a rescuer. let me tell you that. It is not simply a kind of a rescue situation where you dive into a river to save somebody's life. In most cases, you probably would dive if you can swim. Some people will dive without being able to swim. You will, if you're successful, chances are that nothing's going to happen to you. In fact, you may be rewarded. Somebody might be grateful to you or thank you for it. In the case of rescuing, if you are, your life is in danger, I was in Poland in September. I saw a film. Poles are angry a little bit at Jews, even right now, because you see Jews keep saying that, you know, you guys could have helped us, more of you could have helped us. Some of you were anti-Semitic. A lot of you delivered us, or our brothers and sisters, to the Nazis. You're glad that Poland became Judenrein. But the fact is that while this is true, lots of Poles lost their lives rescuing Jews. In fact, I saw a film in September made by Poles, a very accurate and well-documented documentary, shows how Poles were executed in different places, in different spots with the victims that they were hiding. So it wasn't an easy thing to do. Your life was in danger, food was short, and so you really had to do an ordinary amount of, you sacrificed a lot, in other words. So first let me quickly address what the rescuers actually did. They detained Jews through the process of isolation, that is ghettoization. They offered counsel, storing goods for them, offer goods, that is to say, offer them food, sometimes even sell some of their goods in order to help them with food. So really that in itself was dangerous, and economic crimes were also good enough to be executed for, or certainly sent to concentration camp. They also helped them escape from incarceration in camps, usually not sealed death camps, however. I know a cousin of mine was helped to escape from one of those camps in Poland called Plaszów. Helped smuggle or transport them out of the country, and helped find shelter, or themselves provided shelter within their own country. There's a variety of things that rescuers did. They had to do something else which was not easy to do. They had to create what we called, in our book, create new relationships. What I mean is, in the course of rescuing, life continued, obviously. Your relatives were with you still, your cousins, your great-fathers and grandfathers and grandmothers, etc. But now you are in a new situation. You have to be careful. You have to create new relationships. You needed to consider, who shall I tell what we are doing? From whom shall we withhold, I should say, communication or information, what we are doing in the basement or in the attic? Who can stay with us overnight, over weekend? Or are we going to have to tell them, very sorry, sir, or rather, auntie, or aunt, we can't keep you here. You got to go. And the reason was that they had to protect this sort of thing because, you know, the walls had ears, as some people say. So they had to establish these sorts of new relationships. It took imagination. It took time, energy to manufacture new excuses why you can't stay over tonight, why you can't come over to dinner next weekend, and so forth. In other words, what they had to go is they had to go through deception. Had to figure out who can we or can we not trust, and in other words, how will those feelings affect the relationship with the loved ones? It was something not usual. The psychological pressure to keep friendship, love and trust, intimacy at the same time, secrecy, and that's pretty tough to do. Pretty tough to do. Now, as to why did they do it? Well, let me just tell you what we, once again, reiterate quickly what we actually did. as I said, we had a sample of bystanders and a sample of rescuers. And we use all various measures, including in-depth interviewing and of these stories. In fact, the heart of the questionnaire was very often the story. Tell me the rescue story. And then you say to them also, after 20 minutes of recording, or sometimes an hour, you say to them, well, could you repeat to me, tell me the main reasons what made you do it? And a whole assortment of other questions which checked upon each other, each other, try to, in a sense, substantiate or give us more confidence that in the first part of the questionnaire. We use various measures. We use measures like some of you may have used them here, or I'm sure you conversed with them or apply them yourselves. Self-esteem, social responsibility, empathy scales, and locus of control, in addition to everything else, all the other questions about the attitudes of who the models were, the parents, etc., friendships. Did they have friends outside of their own religion? Which groups do they feel are more like them or less like them? Anyway, a whole assortment of questions which I'm not going to go into. But what we found, based upon all this, is we found statistically significant differences. That simply means that the differences, without mentioning the various measures, the chi-squares and the factor analysis, any of this stuff, but we found confidence in the differences, that the differences did not happen by chance, that there's really substantial difference between a rescuer and a non-rescuer, based upon a whole assortment of these measures. Now, we came down to the following assortment of findings. This is not a single. There's no single model. This is a poly-motivated model, or multi-explanation. There's no monistic or single explanation for this. What we could say is the overwhelming majority, 80%, gave ethical reasons for helping. Ethical reasons for helping. There's some other values that they gave, other explanations. For instance, hatred of the Nazis, religion, patriotism, the desire to make an independent statement, a sense of adventure. These were some other explanations, but the overwhelming one, the highest percentage, is ethical values of care, compassion, justice, and so forth. And we have confidence in this, as I keep repeating, only because I think the sample is large enough to warrant this confidence. and that it bears out with what the rescued said, plus it compares that way clearly, or contrasts, I should say, clearly with the non-rescuers. That is what makes us confident in that. So these people then, let me take a look at some what I consider, share with you what I consider antecedent. Rescuer was close to parents, closer to parents than non-rescuers, closer to parents than the non-rescuers. Rescue was close to a family, or the family in general, somebody who was important in the family. A rescuer was less likely to be disciplined as he was growing up, physically, that is to say. He was more likely to be reasoned with when disciplined. He was a little more likely to be told, listen, Johnny, or Ivan, or Michał, or whatever. It's the consequence of your action. You reasoned things out with him. You talked to him rather than receiving some sort of punishment, which the non-rescuers by and large did. They were kicked, they were punched, they were hit, they were thrown around, etc. Okay, rescuers were much more likely to be taught the value of care, as I said, implied before, compassion, kindness, and social responsibility. This was the social cultural milieu in his or her home. The rescuer was absolutely less likely to be taught stereotypes about Jews or outsiders, gypsies, other foreigners. We have developed a measure about these other groups, outsider groups. Rescuers' parents are more likely to belong to more, I guess for a better word, for lack of a better word, more democratic, tolerant political parties or institutions or organizations. So this is the sort of the antecedent factors, the factors or the situations in which a rescuer was brought up, the social, cultural milieu. Now, as to the profile of a rescuer, what does the profile really look like? I think he or she is a person of integrity. He is less likely to be exclusive, that is, he does not exclude others. He's more intense, or he's more likely to include other people in his sphere of caring, or as we used one time the word, in his universe of responsibility. All people are my responsibility. They're characterized by psychological closeness to friends from different groups, including different classes and religion. More empathetic towards other people's pain, particularly. They are freer, by far freer, statistically significant, freer from stereotypes. And I would also say they're more competent. By competent, simply a kind of situation, if you recall a situation, Yamarov saw it and he says, yeah, I think we will figure this out. And then Mrs. X in Tucson saw the 3 pit bull dogs and she couldn't figure out a solution. Doesn't mean she was incompetent or a bad mother. She just couldn't figure out, how can I get involved with the tragedy of another person. So competent in that sense. Also, I think competent in some other ways, be able to lie, to be able to tell stories, cover up, in other words. One rescue in Los Angeles was an excellent skier, was able to get people rescued in Switzerland, because they had to go through winter, snowy mountains in winter and so forth. Okay, one last thing that I wanted to say is that first of all, there isn't a single type of rescuer. There's a variety of different rescuers. These factors that I just enumerated or mentioned are simply a kind of a composition or conglomerate factors, but there's some rescuers are more likely to do rescuing for one reason than another. Let me just give you 3 concentrations or clusters of reasons. I won't go into great details, simply just to mention them and perhaps a brief explanation. There was a group of rescuers who are more likely to be normocentric, if you're writing down the word normocentric. And this simply means is the rescue was, his motivation was triggered largely by the norms of society. It is the right thing to do. My priest says so, that I should help. It is the Christian thing to do. It is the norms of my being, my culture, my village, my town. So the norms were more likely to trigger this motivational man for a person to go and rescue. A second one is allocentric, as you hear it, allocentric. And this is a person who could not stand by to see someone suffer, especially his friends, acquaintances. So he was more likely to rescue because it was his friends that were being brutalized. It was the whole general idea, you should not be cruel to people, irrespective of who they are. And the third one is as you hear it again, there's no trick spelling, axiological type of motivational mechanism. What I mean by axiological here, what we mean by axiological, is that this believes in total universal justice. He would have helped anybody, including a Nazi who was mistreated. It doesn't have to be, in other words, the notion that it is immoral and unjust to do something to people. So it was a kind of universal imperative, a kind of feeling that we ought not to stand by when any group at any time is being unjust in the name of morality and ethics. Not so much in the name of friendship. It's not so much in the name that my priest told me so. It's in the name of a universal sense of a universal imperative that we ought to help because it's unjust. It is unfair. It is it is cruel, and it should not be part of the human experience. So these, while we say that the rescuers had these characteristics, there's between the three types that I just mentioned, three types of motivational mechanisms, reasons, primary reasons, namely normocentric, heliocentric, and axiological. So they overlap. You can't say, well, this man is an axiological, did it because of axiological reasons. There's an overlap. But they're more likely to give you reasons like justice, equity, fairness, or injustice, immorality. I did it because it was immoral. I care about Jews. I would have done it to anybody who was mistreated unjustly. So that's the axiological. And interestingly enough, the smallest group is in this category, the axiological group. The largest groups, depending upon countries. Poland, lots of rescued because of friendship and knowing the victims. And in other countries, it was more the French thing to do. It was more the normative thing to do. It's more the Christian thing to do. Okay, I'm going to stop now because I'm sure there's a lot of things that I have not covered. And as I promised you initially, I didn't promise to be organized in any systematic way. So I was told that there's we have some time for any questions which I will try to field. And if I don't know the answer, I'll try to be honest that I don't know the answer to. So thank you very much. Yes. Sure. Okay, I see. Or demystified or something. Okay, I happen to agree with you. There is, however, a problem with that. Some problem, which is, of course, could be manageable. Depends. If, for instance, I know you're not this person, but there may be an instructor who's not knowledgeable, who's a fence sitter, who really does not know that that Auschwitz really is not a factory where they bake bread, and that a few thousand people died. That was really a killing place. Or if you don't have confidence enough to be able to question this person who tries to tell you the Holocaust is a hoax, question him properly, you might give the impression, some students might be left with an impression saying, well, you know, I'm not really sure that the Holocaust took place. So you have to be confident enough that you can elicit the right questions and get the debate in the way that it can be really strongly balanced, because I can see some of these true believers coming in and they can give you, see, some of the books that I'm sure you know of, they're very reasonable books. In my Holocaust classes, I use literature. I use chapters from the 20th Century Hoax. I use articles from the Historical Review. It's a journal which publishes denying the existence of the Holocaust. Looks very professional. It's subscribing to, by the way. It's published by a hate group in this country. It's the same hate group that publishes a newspaper called Spotlight. It's Carter, a millionaire, multimillionaire, who owns radio stations and other stations and a printing press called the Noontide Press, and he throws around this garbage all over the place. There's also similar material, quote unquote, published in Canada, but much more so than in this country. So yes, I agree with you. Debate ought to be allowed, but I couldn't emotionally face it. But I agree with you. Yeah. I'll make it kind of a little short because it's a little. It may not be the right time this moment for me, but very simply that they incidentally. I've written a book about this called Restless Memories, but what it was that I had one of those ghettos, and I went to a lady escaped from a place where the rest of my family was being executed. In fact, I did not go directly to the execution spot. I hid before that. And then this lady advised me to change my name and taught me the catechism. And I pretended to be a Catholic boy. And she kept, and I went around from one place to another, and I found a job, ironically, working on a farm. The Jews were executed. The farm was given to someone who was anti-Semitic. Okay, so I was working for 3 years, going to church, pretending to be a Catholic, and that's roughly. And this family, about whom I wrote, acted as my authenticators, because this whole thing was my entire 3 years were a fabrication. But they lies to the extent that they kept me on certain days, and they also tried to authenticate my lie by sending their son, who acted as my brother. So the story that I manufactured for these people who I worked for looked like a true one because it was authenticated by gee, this guy has family, he must be legit. So, yeah. But the Institute for the Righteous Acts, which we have a little office there, right? Any other questions? Yeah.
Are you coming to some conclusions about how to make us more
altruistic? Have we, I suppose maybe it would be more appropriate, are we coming to some sort of conclusions as to how this material might be inculcated into a curriculum? Yes, this is a question that we're dealing with. We are dealing with in the sense that I think that we have no doubt, at least I hope we're not true believers, we have no doubt that there is such a thing as a person who is capable of being altruistic often, or frequently, I should say. We also no doubt, we are relatively certain that we know that it's a process that is learned. I don't believe necessarily that there is genes for altruism, but it's a learned kind of, some people do believe that the genetic explanation, the social explanation. We have a little trouble with this. We think that it's really largely social cultural. In other words, it's the nurture versus the nature. So that it can be taught, and it's a question of how to do it and at what age to do it, and that's what we are working on. How do you incorporate it into curriculum? How do you teach small children the consequences of evil? How do you teach small children that bigotry, antisemitism, Nazism can ultimately lead to exclusion, defining people out of the human race, and ultimately to extermination? So I think that it's a question of the proper pedagogical method, stories perhaps, films, role models, that can be actually taught to children. And I think that it probably should, and we're looking into this as far how can some of the materials, some of the findings that will be published, especially in the last chapter, be perhaps a springboard for developing some sort of a curriculum of care. Certainly there's a need, we know that. Certainly that educators are beginning to talk about a lot, and write about now on pro-social behavior, pro-social, which includes altruism. Yeah. You mean beyond rampant individualism? Well, I think there's a receptivity. There's some leaders, as I perhaps mentioned or intended to mention at the beginning, that educators are looking into, even politicians, philosophers, looking into this notion that historians, for instance, recently there's a series in the very fine newspaper, Christian Science Monitor, on the 21st century, Barbara Tuchman and other philosophers and historians, political leaders, Governor Cuomo, for instance, are very concerned about that. You see, there has to be something done in schools because churches may not be adequate, churches and temples and whatever. That something must be done in schools teaching morality, which means decency, justice, caring, compassion. So I think it's a question of getting the right ear for the right publishers, for the right educators who will develop some curriculum. And it's possible, and I hope that it is done. For instance, which one? Which would give me an example? Would think that altruism is to teach people to be decent and caring, compassionate. Mm-hmm. I see. You have a very important question that you raised, very profound question. Because you were saying that it may have been decent for Nazis to kill Jews because they were the enemies of the state. So it is possible that you're looking at it from a relativistic perspective. But I think there is such a thing as universal, not relativistic approach to morality. Universal morality, namely that it is wrong to kill, it is wrong to murder, it is wrong to perpetrate injustice to people. So we have to go beyond the narrower relativistic interpretation of what is patriotic and what is compassionate, and what is decent. Sure. So that kind of morality is really not acceptable to people, not to all people, because they also feel that it's for anyone who, or some, anyone who doesn't believe in Christ is really hasn't got a chance any place. So it's a narrow kind of morality. Yes. Unfortunately not, and I think that I have no doubt, and I know that Professor Steiner knows much more about this kind of aspect of human behavior, but I know that I've heard of stories of incredible caring and rescue. I've interviewed one person, for instance, who has been actually rescued, saved many different ways, a SAS person, or people who were rescued by a factory foreman, the Meister, the person who was in charge of work. He would bring sandwich, for instance, just to give you one tiny example, sandwiches in order to keep some prisoners alive. He would leave them in the bathroom somewhere, near the toilet or near the toilet bowl, in a neatly wrapped package, and he would say to him, I left it over there, and go in the bathroom and find something to eat. So there are people, and I think there was an incredible heroism in some places, in other camps. When the heroism that in fact, the man who got himself canonized as a saint, Father Kolbe, Maximilian Kolbe. I'm sure you've heard of that story, everyone did, right? Where did you? Okay, very, very briefly then. People escaped, and if I mistell this story, John, correct me on this, or exaggerate. People escaped from camps, and the Nazis had a way of, when they caught, as a punitive way is to say one person escaped or two people escaped, every 10th they would kill, let's say, 10 for 1 or 20 for 1. And so they would line up people and they would say, okay, every 10th man step forward. Because that meant you're going to be executed right there and then. And one man, a Pole, apparently was pleading with the executioner, saying, look, I've got a wife and children. Please don't do this to me. I want to live. And the father, this priest, standing behind him, he said to the executioner, please, sir, can I change places with him? And indeed, that's what happened. Indeed, was recently became a saint. And when I was in Auschwitz on my visit, not as a person who stayed there, obviously, I didn't have the misfortune of those people who were in those camps. It was pointed out to me in which being tortured, and because he had some other things going, protested abuses, Nazism. Yeah. Very good question. Yes, part of our question, this lengthy, torturous thing, these poor, they need to deserve another Yad Vashem medal for lasting with us for so long, patiently and kindly and lovingly offering us refreshments while we were torturing them with questions. Well, not torture them exactly, but some of them actually really enjoyed it. Yes, the answer to your question is some of them are still very involved. So that gives us a little more confidence in this characteristic, these traits, that some of them are still helping people. And some people in this country, for instance, a man in Los Angeles has been involved with disabled war veterans. He was raising funds for the Cambodian, the Kampuchean tragedy. The boat people, he was very involved, passionately involved. Do other things, they go around speaking and talking about those days, and hoping that this should be a lesson that we should love each other. So I would say percentage-wise, they're much more involved than controls currently with other people. That was an additional point that gave us some help. I thought you were going to ask, however, another question which suddenly sprung into my head, namely that that some rescuers, see, there were different climates of rescue. You all heard about the Danish people, and the Belgian people. I'm sorry, the Danish people, the Italian people, the Bulgarian people, the Greeks. There are certain countries in which the climate was more conducive to rescue than other countries. And for instance, leadership counted a tremendous amount. The diminished intensity of anti-Semitism counted a lot. King Christian X, I'm sure you've heard this many times, many times. To me, every time I hear this story, it puts shivers through my spine. He defied the Nazis. He himself defied. When he told them he cannot meet his people, he was riding his horse through the streets of Copenhagen. Now I know all the arrangements that Nazis, in some ways, perceive their racial composition, perceive racial anthropology, racist anthropology, treated the Danes as closer to the Germans and the Poles are closer to slaves and inferior and to be done away with, or certainly used as slaves. But that's another kind of thing. That the climate also was helped in different countries. And one last point that I wanted to mention, sort of random points, but still I thought it might be of interest, and that is that some rescuers were after the war hated for their work. A handful of rescuers, some of the rescuers by their own countrymen were ostracized. Rosalind was ostracized, called him the Jew lover. One of the people that I never mentioned, Rosalind, a very famous rescuer. It's one of the hundreds of stories that we have in our files. But he appeared in an article in People magazine where our project was published. He was, for instance, ostracized. Hermann Grabe was the first German, according to Reverend Hennick, who wrote a book about his life story, German engineer to whom I alluded to. He was ostracized by the German community. He was the first German to testify in the Nuremberg trials about what he saw, namely execution pits, which people were being murdered by the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing. Yes, Mr. Harris. Yes, this first book that is being published is more kind of a social scientific analysis using short stories to illustrate some particular finding, a series of short versions. But there's another group that is associated, works with us. She is Professor Len Weber. She is professor of photography, and she is also was one of our very best interviewers. She is going to have photographs of what the people look like during the rescue, before the rescue, now, and a story, complete, well, not a complete, but a summary story of, say, 2 or 3 pages. The data is, what you can do with the data is limitless, and we are continuing to accumulate these. They keep coming in, that is to say, the interviews, while we ran out of money, they're still coming in. People are now saying, I would like to talk also. There's a kind of a publicity that this project has gotten over the years, over the last few years, which is quite substantial. We were in various journals and magazines, and which goes to show, or at least shows me that that there is touched some sort of a chord. People are interested in seeing not so much the horrors that we know existed, but they're interested to see some hopeful things, something that we can roll, something that we can look up as a possible antidote to evil or something. Yeah, it's very difficult, as I'm sure you know. You probably know Film Out is a film out, not a film, a videotape, called Breaking the Silence. I think I sent a copy to someone here at the university. I forget who. Somebody called me and asked me for it. Breaking the Silence precisely deals with this subject, namely that the children of Holocaust survivors, those who have gone through real bad times, have a problem relating, and the children feel that some parts of their parents is not being adequately, is something lacking, and I think that it's beginning to be addressed. There is a group of children of Holocaust survivors, as I'm sure you must have heard. There's one in San Francisco, there's one in various major cities, who are trying to get together and deal with this pain that they feel exists. That you're never completely able to communicate with your parents. And the parents refuse to communicate with the children because they don't want to, well, for several reasons. They don't want to bother them. They feel they don't need to go through this experience. They're trying to protect them. There's a sort of other reasons. But the tape called Breaking the Silence, if you're really interested, I can direct you to it. It's a very powerful piece. It shows the real difficulty with opening up. People break up or break into tears and they can't talk. And
I'd like to thank you very much for this exceedingly
thank you.
long lecture. Thinking about for a long time.
Okay,
Can you try some sound again?
no, it's okay. I'm pretty sure we're recording that that earpiece didn't work. It's cheap. You are Professor Oliner. Would you introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Professor Samuel Oliner from Ponte University. I teach in the Department of Sociology in Arcata, California. And I'm delighted to be here. I'm convinced that the series that you're offering here is an invaluable series, indicated before.
Professor Oliner, I have a question for you. I know that your lecture tonight is going to be on altruism. And personally, I know that it relates to in this series. How do you see the importance? Briefly, I know that you gave a whole lecture on the need for that, be perhaps concise, the need for doing or studying what you're studying.
Well, the need for studying this is, of course, pretty much self-explanatory, partly because it's not been studied yet. The notion of rescuers and the notion of their heroism as to the reasons why they did it. I think that they are extremely an important part of Holocaust studies. I think that we need to balance the course, because it becomes, as I indicated elsewhere, rather unpalatable the way it is. It's the Holocaust by itself, without hope, heroism, courage, is really a story of brutality. It's very depressing, and leaves students very much in a state of hopelessness and helplessness and despair. So I think that that's one of the main reasons why it dovetails well with the series that you are presenting here at this university. Not just the perpetrators, but also, and the bystanders, but also rescuers.
You are teaching a subject on a subject which is very difficult to understand. And many people, especially young people, have very little knowledge about the Holocaust. Why do you think this is so?
It is so because until recently it was a subject swept under the carpet, not taught, not talked about. Even survivors themselves have gone through so much. They're silent. There's a cover of silence because it was too painful. It was something that they felt the world wouldn't believe. It's only the last, say, 15 years or so that the survivors were in a more willing state to tell their story, tell the tragedy that's occurred to them. I don't believe that, well, first as to why it's important, I think it's extremely important, as I had said before, because it is a lesson for the future, as you all know. A lesson for the future. Auschwitz, in my opinion, stands for moral decay of Western civilization. And the lesson of Auschwitz is to change this. That's why it's important. But it is not so difficult. I may not quite agree with you that it is very difficult to teach the Holocaust subject. It is unfortunate that students don't know much when they come to the class. It's true. And it's also unfortunate that a lot of teachers don't know very much about this. But I think the picture is changing. That proper teaching approach can get these people interested in the dilemma which faces humanity. I think proper media and trying to also, I think, to put the Holocaust in perspective and compare them to other genocides that occurred makes the Holocaust more understandable. For instance, if you could compare the Holocaust, which is genocide, to a genocide that has occurred of Northern California in the place that I'm from, Arcata, Eureka. The science citizens of Eureka slaughtered hundreds of Indians by night raids, which have been accident hatchets. So I think that the Holocaust can be brought home by using other examples, what has occurred in Cambodia and what has occurred in Bangladesh, what has occurred in places, Igbo, Nigeria, etc. I guess in sum, I'm saying I don't find difficulty teaching it, and it's a question of how you approach it. And, as I said, media, these discussion groups, bringing survivors who have been rescued, survivors who survived the Holocaust. It's a subject that's important, and I think that we could put across, I should say, to students. Because there may be some who will not get much out of it, but we have a package at Humboldt State University called Nature and Issues of Genocide. It's a series of 3 courses that deals with genocide in other parts of the world, genocide of Indians, and then of course genocide of the Holocaust. And the dropout rate is rather small for one class. Person.
Do you make any connection to the Holocaust, especially the gas chambers, to the nuclear issue?
Oh, very much so. Very, very much so. The world Holocaust, as I'm sure all of us know, telling us common destruction by fire, destruction, burning people, and I think that the Holocaust, the destruction of people, can only serve as an example of indifference and caring. And if we are indifferent and don't do something about this armament, accidental or purposeful nuclear conflagration would be the biggest Holocaust. It paled the destruction of 6 million Jews and 5 million non-Jews in those camps in Nazi-occupied Europe. So I think that they go hand in hand. There's a lesson we learn from to try to prevent this insanity raised to nuclear destruction of the globe. I always make that connection. When I teach class, I have a section in it about nuclear holocaust. I also take a look at ecocide.
Do you mean possible Holocaust, or do you using the term nuclear holocaust? I mean, I know it happened in Japan,
Yes.
but we're talking about something much more larger. So you're talking possible Holocaust.
Possible holocaust.
I think it is necessary to state possible, because otherwise then
Sure.
it's too frightening to consider.
You could see it possible, and without intervention, a likely episode, maybe our final episode.
I have one more question, which has nothing to do with your lecture here. It's a little personal. I was in Auschwitz in '44, August '44. June, July, August, all I know is it was hot. When were you in Auschwitz?
I was in Auschwitz. Well, first of all, I want to again make it clear, I was in Auschwitz as a prisoner. I was in Auschwitz as a visitor, as a person who wanted to see. I was in Auschwitz twice, and I wanted to see.
After the war,
Oh, sure. I wanted to
I
see. I wanted to feel. I wanted to. When some liars write that the Holocaust existed in Auschwitz, the chimneys are bakeries and so forth, I wanted to feel how it felt to walk into one of the chambers that still exists in Auschwitz itself, not in Birkenau. Birkenau's chambers are a story, as I'm sure you know. And so I spent 2 days walking around the barracks and crying. The last one was first one was 77, and the last time was 1986.
I too made the journey back to Poland and visited Auschwitz, and it was a painful journey to go back to where I was separated from my father. My father went one way, I went the other way. But it was also a self-confrontation, a healing process in order to go into those places that
Exactly where
in. And it is a kind of examination of what happened that is a healing and possibly a turning point to ourselves and from which we can teach.
I had the same situation. My parents were executed in mass grave in a little forest near Gorlice, in a little forest called Garboc. And after the war, the people, some Jewish people that survived, got some money together, and they all made a fence around this, concrete fence around it. I went to see it right now, and monuments and mass graves where 1,000 people live in one spot. I had the very same experience that you had. I felt better. I took courage. I prayed. I cried. I felt better. I felt that they had forgiven me for surviving. You see, I survived. I ran. I wasn't with them to be executed. Grandfather, grandmothers, brothers and sisters, and all that. Machine gun was so horrible that all the villages, it was a small little forest, about 1 square kilometer in the middle of a field, which used to be Austrian Army Cemetery in World War I. That's what's mass grave. The horror was so horrendous that people, the villagers, the screams, they ran away, left their houses, came back the next morning, and 1,000 people were executed. The Nazis didn't even cover them up properly. They did a little dirt so they probably smelled horrendous. Told them to take some buggies, dirt, and cover it up.
Professor Oliner, I thank you very much. I think the area of studying and teaching about is very important to show that despite what happened during the Holocaust, during World War II, that there were human beings who were willing to risk their lives to rescue other human beings, and thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.